Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today we have a record club where we're going to be talking about the 2013 album from Altar of Plagues, their final album, Teethed Glory and Injury. And Ryley, this is their record club this week. So I know this is an album that was kind of a gateway for you to this avenue of music. So why don't you tell us a little bit about why we're talking about Teeth, Glory, and Injury here today?
Absolutely, happy to. So, Altar of Plagues, for anyone who doesn't know, were an Irish black metal band. And what's interesting about their progression is that they actually started out much closer to post metal and that kind of, post neurosis, post ISIS sound that was really incorporating a little bit elements of post rock and a lot of elements of atmospheric black metal and a lot also some elements of drone music as well and that kind of thing. And so they started in a much more kind of spacious place. And the record that we're talking about today, which is their by far their most celebrated and well regarded one for a good reason, as it is their clear masterpiece, is a record that incidentally is turning 10 the week this video drops as well. So for me, this was a pretty momentous album in terms of getting into more extreme variants of metal and specifically appreciating black metal, which is one of all of the subgenres of extreme metal. Black metal was one of the ones that I struggled with growing up the most. I mean, even things like death metal, tech death, all these kind of extreme, bizarre, far out forms of really complicated metal were always, for some reason, easier for me than black metal. There's just something about the oppressiveness of black metal. There's something about the deliberate ugliness of black metal that takes it in a slightly more grotesque direction than death metal that I always kind of held me at a bit of a distance. And there were two big landmarks of, I will say, black metal adjacent music in 2013 that helped me, and I'm sure a lot of other people's like me, to appreciate that side of music and that side of metal by melding it with more familiar elements. The other record, of course, being Deaf Heaven Sunbather, which we'll be talking about for its 10th anniversary as well. But this certainly, compared to that record, hews much more to the conventional black metal template, though it also does do a lot of really unconventional and original and exciting things with that, that makes it, at least in my experience, my admittedly somewhat limited experience, one of the most innovative black metal records of all time, frankly, and certainly a real standout in the last in the most recent sort of 2010s era of the genre, where fusions of black metal with other genres became more popular than ever, and the kind of old crusty sort of Norwegian traditionalist associations of black metal have kind of fallen away in a big way. But yeah, Altar of Plagues were an Irish band. This was their third album. This was their big pivot into incorporating much heavier industrial elements into their music, and also interestingly doing that at the same time as both increasing the complexity of their compositions and shortening the runtime of their compositions as well, because their first two records have much longer, more sweeping, more atmospheric and slower paced movements, again taking a lot from the atmospheric black metal and post metal playbooks, whereas here you have a lot more concision in the way that these songs are arranged. The only real exception to that is the big 9-minute centerpiece, which deviates from the formula of the rest of the record in some really notable ways. But for the most part, this is a ballistic, in your face, heavily synthetic black metal album. And a lot of what I love about it is how it does things that you wouldn't necessarily associate with the genre, or you wouldn't necessarily expect to work particularly well, but that actually complement and add to the complexity of the pieces in ways that are rewarding rather than just esoteric or purely experimental for the sake of it. It's interesting, like listening to it this week, even though it's a record that I've had in my life basically since the time it was released. It was interesting to me how I could feel the influence of another post metal band's most recent record at the time this was released, that being Cult of Luna, who released their album Vertical in January of 2013. And that was a step for them in terms of incorporating synthetic, electronic, industrial elements into the post metal landscape. And while that record does very different things to this record, there's something to be said for how representative this sort of trend was in terms of this more extreme forms of metal and the encroaching wave of synthetic elements as a core sort of critical aspect of what the compositions are doing and what the album is shooting for conceptually as well. And while the Cult of Luna album is all conceptually like it's a reimagining of Fritz Lang's Metropolis, it's very much all about hard surfaces and industrial landscapes and kind of the dehumanization of people in those places. This is a very specific and much more kind of intimate album about dissociation, about depersonalization in a much more, I guess, micro sense. It's about having a sense of discomfort and also a sense of alienation from your body, but also from your environment, from your surroundings. There's a lot of, and not a lot of, I'm not saying that the writing on this album lyrically is anything necessarily all that innovative for the black metal playbook, but there is a lot of discussion of dualities in terms of self and feeling a kind of sense of alienation and distance from your body or from who you really are. And we can get into that a little bit, but really I just want to talk about how incredible this record sounds. Jake, I want to hear from you at this point before and you can get into any specific tracks if you want to, but just generally your thoughts on the sound of this record, how it hits you, and overall your impressions of this particular album.
It's funny because this is another album that I feel like I should have heard much sooner than I actually did. Even though I was really interested in the sort of wave that records like these ushered in, I was just, I guess, at the peripheral of that discussion. I wasn't here on the ground floor like you were necessarily. So putting this on was an interesting experience just because I had basically no idea what to expect. I knew of Altar of Plagues, but I didn't know what they were about. I didn't know how, this was going to skew in terms of its approach to black metal, just because in the 2010s, I think it's kind of interesting how far this genre has been pushed away from where it started in lots of new, interesting, innovative ways, and often in aesthetic ways that are, you have bands that come along and black metal isn't primarily what they do, but it is certainly an aspect or an inspiration, or they just draw specific aesthetic trappings and then put that into their music and synthesize it. So when going into this, I didn't know what to expect. And then immediately you get hit with the opener, Mills. And this very much let me into knowing a couple of things. Number one, this was going to have a huge post-metal influence, just because Mills, as an opener to this album, is basically nothing but a slow, gradually escalating buildup to the rest of the record proper. And immediately you're met with this simmering electronic texture that's just pervades throughout this entire album, where it kind of feels like something is beneath the surface of these instrumentals just kind of fizzling. And I couldn't put my finger on it at first where I had heard this exact idea utilized before, but it was in an album that from an artist who obviously draws a lot of aesthetic tendencies from genres like this, that being one of my favorite musicians, that being Chelsea Wolfe and her album Abyss. A lot of what's going on here is like a direct precedent for that. Again, that very electronic textural feeling just kind of pervades this entire album. And that's one thing about this particular sect of black metal that I really get along with, in that I'm not one of those black metal traditionalists. I enjoy everything from everywhere. I don't limit myself. But one thing that I do have a bit of a limitation with sometimes with black metal is the kind of ugly, nastier, lo-fi recording that just sort of, it can be hit or miss with me. For every Blaze in the Northern Sky, there's another album that's just trying to do what that album is doing, and they just don't do it as well. Whereas here, there is clarity, but it's clarity in surface of trying to create a different kind of distortion, a different kind of barrier between the raw instrumentals and the listener. And that is what I find so compelling about this, is that there are drones all over this album. There are occasional really distorted bowed strings at the end of certain songs here. And all of these details just kind of hang in the periphery of this. The whole rest of the album is very much post-metal infused atmospheric black metal. But of records of this kind, I can scarcely say that any of them, at least that I've heard anyway, retain the impact of this. It's not exactly like this is death metal per se, but it has the aggression and the immediacy that a lot of death metal has. It's just polished in a different way. But all of these electronic textures, timbres, ideas, something cool about them is that they never actually feel artificial necessarily. There's nothing about them that's weightless. All of it feels so incredibly fucking tangible. And you get that tangibility as soon as the second track on here, which is God Alone, which after that buildup of Mills, that is when this album starts and doesn't fucking stop, baby.
Yeah. One of the things I love about this record, one of the things I think it makes it so unique and separates it from the pack in terms of black metal, is that, I mean, the defining aspect of black metal, if I were to put it into one word, is oppression, right? It's this creating this suffocating thickness. And what is so innovative about Teeth, Glory, and Injury for me is that it's almost like it finds new ways to be oppressive. Like you have the blaring riffs,
Yes.
although they are, the way that the guitars are processed on this record, they sound like slightly kind of more hollow and slightly kind of more sort of brittle, but at the same time, like they have this kind of electricity kind of pulsing through them. You get that on God Alone really, really strongly. Like the guitars on that song, they shriek and they serrate. You can feel this kind of underlying just brutality to the effects that are being used on it. It's a really violent song, especially coming off of the back of that slow drone build of Mills, which is a great opener, I think, because it establishes atmosphere with the cello drones, and then it introduces the synthetic element, and then it introduces the kind of effects pedal guitar distortion thing, and together it's like you're moving through three different sections that set you up for the different textures you're going to encounter on this record.
It's essentially teaching you how to listen to it.
Yes, there's the softly organic, there's the kind of synthetically warm, and then there's the kind of synthetically ugly. And it just moves you through that until God Alone hits and you just get brutalized, basically. There's shades of, in terms of the industrial side of thing, there's shades of Godflesh and elements of this, but it's like texturally there's a bit of that, but it's
Certainly.
updated for the 2010s. It pushes that slick brutal grind into a faster and more manic place. This is the thing about this record, is while it has moments where you are allowed to breathe and where you're given a bit more space, so much of this moves and operates in such a manic and despairing and kind of despondent place of just constant attack. One of, I think, the most impressive songs on the album, and one of the most emblematic of everything the record does well, is A Body Shrouded. There are just,
Yeah.
again, the guitars blast on this song. They're so relentless, but they are layered with this thick synthetic texture basically all the time that makes them feel so alien, that makes them feel so foreign in a way that makes them scarier, that makes them a little bit more, that makes them more disorienting, that gives you a little bit more of a sense of, I don't know what's happening, and I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know how to process this. And that, I think, functions very beautifully when you think about some of the lyrical content of the song and the record as well. Again, this idea is being pulled apart from my body. There's a part of you that I never knew, and I fall into the hole of your empty space, empty and torn, with a piece of our own fate torn from the body, a part of me you never knew. Like, again, there's this sense of dissociation and separation from yourself. And the record really, I think, separates you from the familiar, separates you from anything tangible by how alien all of this sounds. The drums on the song gallop. They feel like a kind of force that's in constant motion, that's just completely unstoppable. And that intensity that rises through these songs, I mean, you get ebb and flow. Like in the back half of God Alone, you have these kind of softer choral vocals that are by no means pleasant, but they aren't shrieks like the major vocal parts of this record. They have a little bit more in common with the industrial gloom of Have a Nice Life than honestly any other form of black metal vocal.
Thought about that a lot.
But they also, again, they linger in dissonant spaces, and they don't sound all that inviting at all, despite being such a contrast from the scratchier sounds. Burnt Year, the fourth track on here, is one of the most horrific on the entire album. I think one of the most brutal, even coming off the back of those songs. The vocals on this are completely unyielding. They're just sheer relentless torment. I mean, again, there's repeated references to, horrible acts of violence and this sense of not only separation from self anymore, but feeling as though you're watching another part of yourself actually be destroyed, be brutalized, be killed in front of you. And the way the album continues its escalation so that that point feels utterly unbearable is so it's insane, frankly. I mean, what are your thoughts on this like just specifically this first run from God Alone through Burnt Year, this increasing intensity that happens in these three songs?
Not only does this album sort of almost subconsciously sort of teach you how to listen to it from the get-go, it displays an oscillation between the sort of aforementioned mania that you talked about and a sort of stillness. There are lots of segments at the beginning or very end of these songs that kind of break up and will either build into something else, build out of what they're currently doing, and then sort of segue into something else. Lots of transitions on the songs here. We'll have a brief, like, moment of pure silence right before going into something extra or something that's on the next track that'll just kind of bleed into it. And it makes the flow of this absolutely incredible. Their dedication to the album format is really, really respectable, I think, because a lot of the aesthetics of black metal too sort of often build into a reckless disregard for the listener. And I enjoy that aspect of a lot of black metal, but I also can appreciate when there are lengths being taken here to construct the album in a bit more of an intentionally formative kind of way. And I think the moment I sort of knew that I was going to be just totally head over heels in love with the album is Burnt Year, because those vocals on this song, really across this whole album, honestly, are really, really kind of deceptively diverse in their employment. There's shrieks, there's howls, there's bellows. This guy is switching it up constantly, but never enough to the point where you don't know that it's not him. He's a very singular presence on this record, and I really appreciate it, especially when on songs like Burnt Year, he really leans into the legibility of his voice, and you just hear this harrowing cry, borders sketched without song, a child was buried here, here my son was buried, and God danced around the coffin, and we danced with your God, and I watched my mother's body raped by a prophet, I watched my son die. And that's when you know that these guys, you know, regardless of what they're doing with all of their different aesthetics across the record, they are committing to the soul of the genre by pitch black bleakness. For every moment of this album going into something a little bit more heady, something a little bit disassociative, something that's a little bit more purely ephemeral in terms of its emotions, it'll also just occasionally go for the gut, just immediately, and you just sort of feel it. Like when you hear him say, "and here my son died," you're just like, oh, oh my God.
It's used as another form of disorientation in the same way that the ridiculous contrast within the music and the somewhat unpredictability of these structures works. Like there's a sense with which the album, what I like about it is I agree that it works structurally very well, especially when you take a step back and you think about the flow of the album from a distance rather than moment to moment. But when you actually listen to it, there's a lot of unclean transitions between songs. Like Mills into God Alone is like such an abrupt shift. Like it feels like the album's on shuffle. And there's a couple of other moments as well where it feels as though one song moves into another in a specific way where the cut that they use feels off. And there's something to that. There's something to that purposeful disorientation in the way that those transitions work that really elevates that sense of just sheer panic that and this sense of helplessness and loss of control that the album really kind of impresses upon you. And I want to, at this point, talk a little bit more, have a slight tangent to talk a little bit more about the electronic side of the record, which is ever present. Like I said, that synthetic textures that coat the guitars and a body shrouded in particular are just one of the most distinctive aspects of the album's sound to me. But when you get into the centerpiece of this record, A Remedy and a Fever, which I think is one of the most impressive things here. But also so different from the rest of the album in a lot of ways. Like you have had this incredible build in intensity for the first half of the album, but you're left suspended in this much more forwardly electronic and even droning space. And I think about
Hmm.
2013. When I think about 2013 in music, one of the things I think about, besides that, wave of hipster metal that this may or may not be a part of, depending on your perspective, I also think about the wave of electronica that swept over that year as well. Some of the most significant electronic records of that year. And there's a big theme in the electronic records of 2013, which is that they're really fucking dark for some reason. There's this real, just suffocating claustrophobia to a lot of what was happening in electronic music in 2013. I think of the Hexen Cloaks, Excavation. That was his major breakthrough album. And that record is fucking diabolical. Just a lot of empty space, a lot of reverb, a lot of drone, but just these brutal stabs of violence. You can see, the roots of the collaborations he would go on to do with Björk and with Ari Aster for the score for Midsummer and Hereditary as well. And all of that comes, like, the Hexen Cloaks Excavation was such a huge record for electronic music in 2013. And when you look at what it is just this brutal, just horrible, nasty thing. And you had the field with Cupid's head as well, like this. That's a particularly dark record for that artist. Even in the electronic pop world, Baths with Obsidian, that's a really just depressing and dour and suffocating album. It owes a lot to Nine Inch Nails. Fuck Buttons with Slow Focus as well. That's a really insular record. Tim Hecker with Virgins. Oneotrix Point Never with R+7. 2013 was such a year for electronic artists taking their toolkit and creating something truly just that would truly suffocate you in these textures. And it's so ever present. And I don't want to, theorize as to why that is, whether it's just a trend that I'm seeing, but it feels as though it bleeds into the music here as well. And for as much as I love all of those albums that I've mentioned, and as much as they provide some of the best electronic music of the 2000s, I haven't even mentioned Ortega's Exile, which is obviously my favorite electronic record of the year. It kind of sits in a bit of a different place. Despite all of that, A Remedy and a Fever on this album, I think, is one of the best electronic tracks of 2013. There is something to this piece, the way that it moves, the way that it leaves you suspended in space, but then, in true Altar of Plagues form, upsets that by throwing you into a new sequence of the track, like the midsection of the song, which is utterly harrowing. One of the most memorable things that haunts me in my darker moments when I'm thinking about this album is the push and push and just screaming halfway through this song. It's just so brutal. And then that all falls out into this melancholic and beautiful and dissociative and dreamlike final section as well. I am like, it is the longest song on the record because it is the most ponderous and it does the most things that require space and time. But I am never less than totally enraptured by what this piece is doing and by the way it's cleaving the record into these two distinct halves so beautifully. And then the way that runs into 12 is Ruin, which is an exercise in dynamics par excellence, because this is the one song on the record where I think Altar of Plagues maybe teach you the most how they construct a song, because it has one of the most conventional structures in the sense that it is a slow build where the band are just starting in a more simple place at the beginning of the song and just adding elements. You have those distinctive, distorted stabs that happen all across this song that are so like, it's just that kind of sound that gives me goosebumps. It feels just wrong. And they use that to capitalize and signal a new shift in the song structure. So yeah, the way that this album just sort of goes from that onslaught of those first four songs, or the tracks 2 through 4 anyway, and then gives you this collapse into the abyss with Remedy, and then the slow build back into that more oppressive space. It's just such a journey the album takes you on at this particular point.
Yeah, 12 Was Ruin has some of my favorite, like, I feel like it uses its more traditional structure to sort of layer all of these deceptively ornamental ideas onto the song in ways that don't immediately make it apparent to you, maybe on first listen, which is why on first listen, I found the front half of this to be a little bit more immediately gratifying than the back half. Not to say there was a huge disparity in quality. It's just that I feel like the album almost gets a little bit more ambitious in its second half, and you just kind of have to go where the band ends up taking you. There are these in the second half of 12 was Ruin, there are these like those drones that just sort of accent the mix in that final just sort of half to third of it. It sounds like an industrial version of the Tyrannosaurus roar from Jurassic Park. It is just an
Ooh.
ungodly, otherworldly, monstrous noise. And it doesn't even feel like it's fully there. It almost feels like you're hearing an echo of it. And it makes the sizes of these songs, again, particularly on the back half, there's a sense of almost cosmic, otherworldly, Lovecraftian scale on this one that really feeds into one of the most underappreciated and probably underrated tracks on the album for my money, which is Scald Scar of Water,
Mm.
where right after you get the traditional kind of build of 12 was Ruin, this is a song that just kind of snakes in and out of different ideas throughout the entirety of it. And I at first I was like, this is really cool. I'm not sure how much I like this compared to the rest of the album, just because again, it's doing a whole lot. But once I kind of settled into this album's groove, this is one of the most gratifying moments on here. And it sort of builds to that final segment of it, which actually has a lot of gang vocals that do sound a lot like Have a Nice Life. Like
Mm.
this band definitely listened to Death Consciousness once or twice before making this record. And hell, actually, there's a lot of ideas on here that kind of feel like they forecast some of the things that they would do on the Have a Nice Life follow up in the following year in 2014. It feels like
Yeah.
they took a lot of ideas that maybe from, the hipster metaler kind of crowd where they just sort of envelop you in these really, really electronic, but still brutal and kind of violent sounds. I think that's the best word to describe Teeth, Glory, and Injury as a whole, is that this is an album that is unrelenting in its violence
Mm.
against the listener, instrumentally, against the performers, because it feels like they're performing under some kind of weight or duress. And that
Mm.
feels really, really awesome when you go from the, ambitious craziness of Scald Scar of Water into the brutal tense immediacy of Found Oval and Final, this sort of like one final like rage scream burst right before the very end of the album. It's
Mm.
one of the shorter tracks on here, but still feels like it's just sort of getting out any excess tension to just sort of bring you to that final closing track.
Absolutely. One of my thoughts about the album structure and kind of how it makes me feel is, like, as we've said, that first half is this increasing intensity, and it's kind of like it gets louder, and it's like the room around you is getting smaller and smaller and smaller until you're just withdrawing completely, and you're inside yourself with Remedy in a fever. You're inside this sort of safe place that you take yourself. But then, even then, when the heavy part of that song comes in, it's like you're being pulled out of that again. And so if the first half of the album feels like the walls are kind of closing in around you, the second half of the album kind of feels like you're spiraling downward. There's this sense with which everything is going from bad to worse, and all of the threatening, doomy, sort of dissonant, intense elements that the album has kind of teased out are no longer kind of hidden behind the comfort of the heavy, straightforward riffs and the constant barrage of change ups in structure, and the immediacy of songs like God Alone and Body Shrouded. With Scald Scar of Water, one of my favorite aspects of the song is it has this doomy two chord alternating pattern, this A B thing that goes back and forth, and it feels like you're kind of on a boat and just sort of completely cast adrift, or that you
Ooh,
are indeed kind of
yeah.
spiraling down like some kind of whirlpool, basically. And the song never lets you really hold on to anything for too long. And Found Oval and Final kind of continues that beautifully as well. There's these, again, one of the trademarks of this band is that, or this album anyway, is that every so often, once you feel like you're kind of comfortable, you kind of have a sense of yourself in any of this music, they'll put these stabs in that just completely disorient you and disrupt the flow time-wise of the song as well. I mean, this is not an album that necessarily relies super heavily on like polyrhythms or weird complex rhythmic patterns, but it does change a lot, and that really fucks you up as you try to kind of get a grip on what you're experiencing. And like what you've said with Chelsea Wolfe and Have a Nice Life, and what I've said with Hacks and Cloak and Tim Hecker and whoever, it's really hard not to make far off, far out, very different comparison. But it's hard not to draw from really far off comparison points because there's just so little to actually draw from, that in terms of things that sound like this. The one band I thought of, I mean, Deathspell and Mega get brought up a little bit in conversation around this album, which I hear to a certain extent. I also thought of Blut aus Nord, which is another atmospheric black metal band that do similar things with these kind of heavily intense soundscapes, and they were a bit more sort of atmospheric in the kind of organic sense, I guess, with their 2000s work. But with the 777 trilogy and with some of their more recent albums as well, they've incorporated more industrial elements, and that feels like a little bit of a passing the torch to a certain extent. They're obviously legends, like they've been around since the 90s, so I wouldn't be surprised if Altar Plagues are pulling from them a little bit. But yeah,
very much so.
It's the kind of record that makes me just so excited about diving more into the world of unorthodox black metal, but also just at the same time spoiling me in a certain sense because it's so hard to find stuff that does what this album does. All that said, Reflection Pulse Remains, the closing track here, is one of my favorite pieces of metal ever, as in general. Certainly I'm biased because this was one of the first really extreme metal albums I ever heard, so it's just stuck with me for the longest. But this particular piece of music as well, it feels like, you've been spiraling on this downward slope the album's taken you on, and this is like the slope you're heading down on, just it cuts off into a cliff face and you're just falling through this last song. It is completely terrifying. And one of the things that makes it gives that an interesting dynamic is that there's this feeling of falling, but it's also like feeling musically one of the more straightforward songs on the record. It's pure catharsis. It's these ringing guitar leads that just send you through the stratosphere, basically, that just send you into space. And it was one of the more memorable songs on the record for how just great those leads are and how enveloping they are. But really what is happening here is just complete free fall. It's complete loss of control. It's just terrifying, but cathartic in the most immediate and gratifying and intense way. And it feels like the album just completely sticks the landing with this in the most perfect way possible. It could not have ended better than in something that gives you, after so much just claustrophobic tension, just gives you a release of that.
And the lyrics to this song work in a real synergy with that, because there's lots of there's allusions to light coming down, holding on but not being able to, and the fact that the album ends on the sort of stanza of "I am not here, I was not here." That shit is fucking haunting. You hear that and you're just kind of you're in a headspace where this album does to you what the album is thematically about, where it feels like you are becoming untethered from your physical self. And then once you're here at the end of this record, the furthest from yourself that you've been, and you hear that, and it's the type of lyric that only makes sense to you when you're in a state of emotional liminality, where you're just kind of whoa. And then that, again, I can only co-sign everything here. This is the best song on here, but it's not just the best song on here because it's a perfect metal song, which it is, but also because it works in perfect synchronicity with the album that comes before it. It's just a quintessential example of tying the bow around the present that is this musical experience. It's absolutely gobsmacking.
Yeah, it's just beautiful and surprising and gratifying in so many different ways, as well as kind of giving you a couple of final moments of jarring cuts as well, like the way the song kind of falls into this militaristic industrial drum pattern midsection before refinding itself again. The little bit of in the last minute of the song, the little bit of static that just kind of cuts out, and then the riff comes in again with the bass underneath it. But even that final iteration of the guitar part ends sooner than you expect it to, and you're just kind of awash in static. It's that final reminder that nothing is as it should be, that nothing really has order. Even if the song feels like it has a little bit more order than the rest of the record, it still doesn't have perfect order, and you're still getting those upsetting, jarring moments where you just don't quite get the full finality that you might expect or might want. There's enough there for it to be satisfying, but there's still enough holes in that for it to be true to what the album is about. And that really makes it perfect. I mean, I throughout the years, this record's been a comfort to me, especially. I mean, there's a while I went without listening to it, but coming back to it more recently now, I resonate with it more than ever. I mean, I don't need to go into, anyone who listens to the show fairly regularly, I don't need to go into the myriad of reasons why I resonate with the dissociative themes of the album. It's just a very common concept, a very common theme explored in a lot of metal, but here just in a particularly heartbreaking way. I mean, that's the thing about this record, is that it's oppressive, it's disturbing, it's all of these things that you expect black metal to be, but also emotionally at the core of it, it is heartbreaking. It's sad, not just like, you know, upsetting or whatever, but just genuinely sad and tragic. And it doesn't really have a sense of closure by the time you get to the end of it. You get catharsis, but you don't get closure. And that's an important distinction with this album. Yeah, I think it's incredible. And I wanted to do a video to celebrate it for its 10th anniversary, even though I know that the audience for a record like this is fairly limited, but I wanted to put it out there as well. If there's anyone out there who enjoys this record as much as we do, or has any additional thoughts on the album, please do let us know at home. If you enjoyed this episode, please throw us a like and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Both those things help us out an awful lot. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even further, you can hit the join button for just $1 a month. Support us directly, become a member of the Jams and Tea family, get your name in the title call of every video on this channel. Plus, if you want to recommend us some music to talk about on our now episodes, your recommendation will go to the top of the pile. Until next time though, folks, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Gatorade. Is it in you?